G'day, mate. Welcome to a brand new week of Paul Murray Live and some big breaking news this Sunday night. The coalition is back together, but who will be leading both or either of the parties by the end of this parliamentary week? We'll all find out together. Tomorrow, a court will decide whether or not protests will be allowed to take place as the Israeli president rolls into Australia. Either way, the protests will take place because that's what they always do. And a reminder, not next Sunday, but the Sunday after, last one of the month, we're going to be in Burnie in Tasmania. If you'd like to join us for our town, thanks to our wonderful friends at Harvey Norman, it is our favourite thing that we do, which is to go around Australia. We've done it for years. We do it the last weekend of each and every month. Burnie in Tasmania, please. Your first name, your last name, how many guests do you want? There's a limit, of course, and a mobile number so we can get back in touch with you. So please do all of that to ourtown@skynews.com.au. Burnie in Tassie, Sunday the 22nd of February. But first, breaking news, the Australian newspaper has just released what could be a devastating Newspoll for the leadership of Sussan Ley. It shows the collective coalition in its worst position ever, with a primary vote of just 18%. Now, this has also been split where it is 16% for the Liberals, 2% for the Nationals, but One Nation continues its climb. Now above a quarter and on its way towards a third of all voters. As you can see, Labor has gone up since the last survey was taken 2 weeks ago. One Nation has been the beneficiary by 5 points, up now to 27%. This is in and around the numbers which we have seen in both the Resolve poll, the Essential poll, also the publicly released Redbridge poll. The most important poll of all, which of course is the Sky News Pulse, that came out 2 weeks ago. Again, numbers pretty similar. That is being tabulated. Tomorrow we will have the Sky News Pulse for you, which will probably show the same thing, which is unsurprisingly, after the disgrace that has been the breakup and how long the breakup was and for seemingly how little an issue that has all been. Well, of course, the main beneficiary has been Pauline Hanson. Not to mention, as the movie, the super progressive movie, has been making its way around the country, the controversy in and around the song connected to all of that, you pick it. There's a whole bunch of reasons why Pauline Hanson's One Nation is surging. Of course, Corey Bernardi jumping on board, helping with the momentum at least, yes, in state politics at South Australia, but seemingly every day is a positive one, news-wise, for One Nation. Tonight I'll talk a little bit about how some of the establishment figures are going to start to line up to try to pull those numbers down onto the assumption that if you're a One Nation voter, you're never going to go back to the Libs, which means somehow you'll go back to the Labor Party. It's strange logic, but we'll get to all of that very shortly. Also worth noting here too, remember when at the last federal election, it was One Nation that had 6% of the vote. The Greens now at 12%, well, they would have been double. Well, now, of course, multiples of that. More than doubling of the Greens' vote for One Nation is an extraordinary result, given that the Labor Party only needs the Greens and its numbers in the Senate to be able to pass any piece of legislation. Presumably, a Liberal Party would be able to do the same when it comes to One Nation if they, again, are able to get a senator out of most states, which all of this polling would suggest would be what happens. But, of course, those have to come off the Labor Party or the Greens. They have to come off a Jackie Lambie. The reality is if there's just a giant seat swap on the centre-right of Australian politics, then Labor is still in a commanding position. Tonight it's interesting to note that there is no two-party preferred. Now, at the previous federal election, it was 55 to 45. That started to blow out to 57-43 towards the end of last year. It came back to 55-45 after the events and the Prime Minister's handling in and around Bondi. But the reason tonight we don't have a two-party preferred is because the preference behaviour of One Nation is not as reliable as the Greens. So I think it's about 8 out of 10 Greens always end up preferencing the Labor Party. The number is lower when it comes to One Nation. And that was when it was just 6% of the vote. What preferences would happen once you start to get past 10, 15 or 20%, in part, is apparently the reason why there is no reporting on that. But to the Sussan Ley of it all. There is another week before Parliament takes another break before it comes back in the lead up to the federal budget. And the question is whether Sussan Ley will still be the Leader of the Opposition by this time next week. Now, the Liberal Party is in its worst polling position it has ever been. And Sussan Ley, in terms of preferred Prime Minister, is now as unpopular as Simon Crean was the best part of 25 years ago when John Howard was at his absolute best. You can see there that the difference being that the Prime Minister there, not quite at 50%, but at 49%. Sussan Ley is at 30%. Now, those 30% are very loyal, very, very loyal. Now, I'll speak in a second about Sussan Ley's leadership, but for those that are thinking about moving, they will use today's opinion polls to say, well, as a team, we've never been lower, and as a leader, they have never been in a worse position. But there are a couple of X factors. In fact, let's get to them right now. Well, as you know, today, Sussan Ley and David Littleproud, they made their changes and have come to some sort of a compromise, and they will be back together, not fully back together, but they are back together as of this afternoon, the Liberal and National Party. Now, collectively, they are sitting at, well, still above half, but not that high above half compared to One Nation. If the expectation is that somehow, magically, things are going to turn around, well, just a reunification isn't going to have that happen. Obviously, you need everyone who's been pulling in 100 different directions to start pulling in one, even if it is behind a leader that they're not that thrilled with. Now, I say that because that is the reality. But of course, we know that it was the National Party who were able to, largely, with the right flank of the Liberal Party, spend many, many months post-election talking about net zero. They landed on a position that supposedly was the ultimate and important one to be able to take on the government, which has only got stronger since the last election. And in actual fact, deep inside the analysis of the Newspoll, if there was an election held this weekend, Labor would increase its majority because of those One Nation preferences. So a lot of people are going to say it's all about Sussan Ley. Well, hang on, what about the policy positions here that supposedly were the beginning of the reset? Is everyone going to start arguing for those? Is everyone going to start fighting for those? Or are they trying to try to pretend that either the failure to move, and that is the reality, the failure to move the polls as a result of every policy and strategic decision which has been made since the election comes down to the decisions being made, or whether they're going to try to blame it on the person who's made the decisions. For their point, Sussan Ley and David Littleproud, well, they're trying to tell us everything's okay, water's under the bridge, Mum and Dad have got a bright future together.
I think that says to the Australian people that you've got a coalition that cares, that we are better together, that we are two parties. A coalition isn't one party, but we're two parties, and we've been able to work together.
Now, as a person who is paid to pay attention to this, I've got to say at times I've just zoned out, trying to work out what is the actual problem here. Now, again, if you want to take it from the National Party perspective, it was they were forced to vote for a piece of legislation that they didn't like when it came to the hate speech legislation and the gun laws. From the Liberal Party perspective on all of this, or at least Sussan Ley's perspective, was, well, if Shadow Cabinet makes a decision, and we were making decisions in real time about what we could or couldn't shave off the edges of that bill, well, once we make a decision, and if any member of that room, the Shadow Cabinet, votes against it, well, then bang, you're booted out of the Shadow Cabinet. Quite correctly, it has been pointed out that the party room decisions of the National Party actually supersede that of the broader Shadow Cabinet. Well, all of that in part is what is being dealt with, and apparently they're fixed in the part of this conversation. Now, the people who voted against that, of course, being, among others, Bridget McKenzie and Ross Cadell, they, along with every other National, will not be able to return to the Shadow Cabinet until March. This is a extension, meaning they sit on the backbench again this week in Parliament, but then they're back as Shadow Ministers quickly after that. A decision has also been made now that the Shadow Cabinet is above the individual party room. So if a majority of Nats say we want to go this way, but a majority of Shadow Cabinet says they want to go that way, the Nats that are in Shadow Cabinet have to go with everyone else in the Shadow Cabinet. The only way that can be overruled is if a majority of the joint party room, i.e. all of the Libs, all of the Nats, all of the opposition, lower house, upper house, all in one room, decide that the position taken by the Shadow Cabinet is the one they don't agree with. Now, generally speaking, if your Shadow Cabinet is going to be rolled by, for want of a better term, the backbench, well, then there are serious problems that come into the leadership. But of course, all of this feeds into a general sense about serious issues in and around the leadership. Now, here's the deal. Now, Sussan Ley has, at times, been her strongest supporter and at times, tactically, her own worst enemy. Now, that's not me each way elbowing, it's just me trying to explain that, as I told you from the moment she became the leader, there was an opportunity for a reset, there was an opportunity for a reintroduction, there was an opportunity for her to be a new face on a party that had been pretty aggressively rejected, not just at last year's election, but of course back in 2022. The problem, of course, is that there are many people inside the Liberal Party who think that any lurch towards the right is somehow furthering their problems. But of course, the number of people who are paid up and proud members of the Liberal Party who help pick the politicians, or the National Party who pick the politicians, well, they want things like net zero gone. So you have a scenario where, yes, some of the elected smarty pants seem to think a little more than the people who help get them elected, but there's an unenviable task when you are trying to herd the collective cats, the left and the right of your own party, let alone the want when it comes to the National Party. Now, Sussan Ley could have, and in my view would have been in all rights if she wanted to say, all right, that's it, you're gone. Those who decided to vote against shadow cabinet, she could have then closed the door behind the Nats, including when they made the decision, and there was that farce of the bloke who had no chance of rolling the leader, but that, of course, was used by some to say there was no need for negotiation, or about a week of negotiation just disappeared because behind closed doors David Littleproud was supposedly propping up his job. Well, that was a pretty easy task, so he should have been able to chew gum and walk at the same time. Now, what ended up happening here was that Sussan Ley, who could have announced, because the Liberal Party had more MPs than National MPs, she could have announced her own version of the opposition exclusively about the Liberal Party. She could have been able to shore up some of her leadership by some of the people who freewheel behind her back on television, or certainly in an anonymous sense, often the same people. Well, she'd be able to pull them into the tent and get a little bit of discipline and solidarity. Instead, no, she didn't want the coalition to remain any more broken than the National Party was willing for it to be. Remember, it was the National Party who made the decision, one out, all out. It was the National Party who made the decision, unless it is one in, it's all out. It's the National Party who made the decision to drag this out for the best part of 17 days. So a tick for Sussan Ley has to be when it would have been very easy for her to have slammed the door, to have blown up, to have tried to draw a line under a situation in order to bolster herself up as a leader. She could well have done that. It may well have played a little better with the gallery types, but of course the gallery types are not the people who are the supporters of the coalition. So she's a little damned if she does and damned if she doesn't, but this is what she said about the negotiating style, about the fact that it took 17 days, and clearly about her having a personality that is able to get through some of the nasty stuff that has been said about her, not just anonymously to journalists, but on camera.
I want to recognise and thank all of our colleagues, our grassroots party members and party officials who have worked with us to restore the coalition arrangements. And we've put together a clear framework that strengthens the way we work going forward.
Part of the problem for the Liberal Party about where the Liberal Party is right now is that with the numbers the way that they are, the number of big personalities is not really being watered down by a whole bunch of other people that are willing to toe the line further up and down the backbench. It means that when you've only got the numbers that they've got, that things become, well, very fluid. In the same way that if you, say, had 100 people in a room and you needed to convince 51 of them, well, of course, if one person changes their mind, it has an impact, but it's not as dramatic as if you've only got 40 or 30 people in the room and you've got to convince 15 or 20 of them. The smaller the number of MPs and senators, the bigger the drama goes for if one of them decides to change their mind. Now, we know that if the leadership vote that was held after the last election was held again with the number of people that are in the parliament today, it would have been Angus Taylor that was the leader. because three important votes that got Sussan Ley to the leadership are two from people who are no longer in the parliament, being Linda Reynolds or Holly Hughes. And then remember, because there was a hope, a wing and a prayer that Giselle Capterian was going to win the seat of Bradfield for the Liberals, well, she'd be able to help come down to Canberra and pick the leader. So those three votes are gone. So the assumption is that at least a very close to, or perhaps a majority of people were willing to change from Sussan Ley. But of course, the problem for those who want to change from Sussan Ley, they have always failed to answer the question of, well, what changes? What's different? Now, in Australia, the reality post the election, and it ain't fun for me to say, but it is just the truth. The scoreboard is 55-45, the result of which, thanks to preferences, ends up with the Labor Party having more than 90 seats. Does anyone think that Peter Dutton was moving too far to the left? I don't think so. Were there lots of problems in the way that they ran that election? Bloody oath. But there are many complicated things to be dealt with here before an obvious solution takes place. My view is the joy of a 3-year term is that what is the urgency? Oh, the numbers this week determine what we'll do on Thursday. Well, why not wait till a budget in reply? Why not stabilise all of the changes for, again, another 6 months, where the numbers may well be exactly the same in 6 months' time? They could be worse, they could be better, but that's the point. No one knows. What are the main policy ideas about why the party should go in this direction or that direction? And here's the absolute truth. I'm not sure that many people who've decided to tune out of the Libs and go to One Nation are interested in ever coming back to the Libs until, ironically, they're going to be close enough to getting to government. So it's a horrible predicament. It is not one that you'd wish on your worst enemy, let alone people who, 5 million of us, voted to make the government last year. For his part, Tim Wilson, who, yes, says one day I'd like to be leader, well, he is behind Sussan Ley, but of course he is. They are of similar ilk in the party.
Sussan's the leader, I'm supporting Sussan, and that should be our focus. I'm not going to speculate on different colleagues and all of these different games that are going on. The key thing is to make sure that we're united behind the leader, behind a policy program that will then advance the interests of Australians. That's what they want us to do, and that's what they want us to be talking about.
As an observer of all of this for as long as we've been together, the thing that frustrates me here is that what's great on paper for the Liberal Party is that everyone's able to go in whatever direction they want. They don't have the big whip on them like the Labor Party does. So therefore, the middle, the left or the right, there's always about a third that are somewhat left out of the power base or the leadership of the party. Whichever third that is, of course, because they're able to freely express themselves, can often cross the floor, can often publicly suggest that the party's in the wrong place. So I don't know whether part of the answer here is some sort of caucus discipline, some sort of ability that it really has to be bad for people to start freewheeling. But free advice to anyone. If currently it is the 2/3 that are the middle and the left of the party that are in charge, or in a week's time it's the middle and the right, remember the other third, because the other third is always able to freely say whatever it wants. When there are so few people in the room, they have to commit to a better sense of discipline. One where, yes, you are not the Labor Party, where you have to have the scenario where things like Penny Wong has to turn around and pretend she's against same-sex marriage when we all know she wasn't. That's, of course, ludicrous. But equally ludicrous is that when you're in the fight of your life and everyone's rowing in a different direction, well, how can you at all be assumed to get into the fight? So at the start of the week, it is the centre and the left that are the majority of the party. By the end of the week, it may well end up being the centre and the right. But whatever it happens by the end of the week, everyone has to realise that the enemy is not from within, because you will become yesterday's news faster than you can become tomorrow's plan for a recovery. Again, I don't like saying that because I was one of the 5 million people who definitely did not want the current government to be re-elected. And the current government is a bad government. It's a bad government that gets away with being able to make life harder for Australians. Last week, a third of the country life got harder. Why? Because of interest rates. The bloke who should have been held responsible, well, he's allowed to get away with distractions like this.
Assure the Australian people that even with the disintegration of the coalition, even with their kind of unedifying attempts to just try and be a paler shade of orange, the government's very focused on the cost of living, on housing, on our economic challenges, and we won't be distracted by the bin fire.
Well, as opposed to the redder shade of green, but again, about the Treasurer. Now, we are caught in this boring, repetitive cycle that happens every year under every government, which is what feels like months, but it's probably only a few weeks. And will you rule it in and will you rule it out about a budget? And all sorts of things are told to us that if they do this one thing, everything will be saved. If they make this one decision, the sky will fall in. But the reality of Australian politics is that regardless of who ends up in power, the government always finds a way to try to hand out more money. Now, this government has spent more money than any government in the history of ever in Australia, and they want to pretend that that does not have any sort of a stimulatory effect on the economy and thus means inflation starts to go up and Reserve Bank needs to get involved and pull the handbrake.
You said government spending was not a factor in the decision. Was it a factor?
Well, David, our political opponents and their acolytes are deliberately and dishonestly trying to conflate two different things.
Yeah, don't you love that? As one of the acolytes being suggested there. He thinks we're too dumb to notice what they're doing. And anyone who has come to a position that is critical of a government that is going to be running 10 budget deficits ahead of 40 budget deficits, according to his own Treasury and the intergenerational report of a couple of years ago, that we are the ones who are trying to miscue the problem. Well, of course, what he is also ignoring is that the very person who sits at the table that makes the very decision about whether interest rates go up or not, well, it kind of matters what her opinion is. Now, because she's independent, yet, of course, the government decides who's on the Reserve Bank, they can help change or finesse or rig, depending on your language, the rules of how the Reserve Bank works. They never really want to get out of step with the government. So they say that government spending is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. But then sometimes they have to get into a scenario that's not a press conference. When you're giving evidence before a parliamentary committee, where you kind of have to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, a little bit like you're in court. So, Reserve Bank Governor, about government spending, please.
Mathematically, you're right. Public demand, expenditure and private sector, all of that adds to demand. That's logical, it's mathematical, that's what happens.
But of course, dare point out any problems with this government. Don't you just like, they've got all the different ways, right? If you criticise them, it's because you're part of the far right, the extreme right. Or they just come out and call you dumb. And that's pretty much what, of course, the Treasurer is doing. And because of the problems that I sadly spend too much time talking about, and I don't want to talk about them, because the target, in terms of a better country, is doing any and everything that you can to point out the failures of this government in order to change this government. But alas, if an election was held this weekend, they'd get even more seats than the 90 plus they got at the last election. Can you believe it? Unbelievable. The Israeli president will arrive in Australia tomorrow, and there is a lot of drama and security that comes in and around Isaac Herzog and his arrival. He is here upon the invitation of the Prime Minister. He will play a significant role tomorrow, meeting with many of the families of those who were most broken by the events in Bondi. Well, of course, he is the constitutional head of state of Israel. And Israel's response to October the 7th has been one that has led to major destruction and many, many thousands of people that have died in Gaza. Now, what is really important to note here is that, and I was just looking at the structure of things, the President of Israel is not in charge of the IDF, does not tell them where to go. It is a ceremonial role in terms of the army. It is the Prime Minister and the government who have a more direct relationship with telling the army in which direction to go and how hard to hit. But the reality is that because This is the President of Israel. This is the opportunity for those that have often taken to the streets to do so again. And they plan to do so tomorrow in massive numbers and many days across the week. And they're even willing to go to court to challenge laws which are telling them to stay out of the CBD or go anywhere near the traditionally Jewish communities of the eastern suburbs of Sydney.
Isaac Herzog, who of course has been found to have incited genocide in Gaza. This kind of powers are meant to be used for things like sporting and cultural events, certainly not for a political tour by a foreign head of state who is accused of genocide.
Now, we'll watch all of that tomorrow. Look, it is before the courts. The guess would be that, as we've seen in the past, no matter what the laws are, somehow the courts end up finding a way for the process to take place. One of the ways to get around it, unlike what took place, say, with things like the Harbour Bridge, there's already fencing up in and around important buildings in Sydney, meaning physically they won't be able to get anywhere close to where the president is, but watch this space. But that said, something also really important to note, it's popped up in the past couple of days, and it is to do with the graves of Australian soldiers at an international war grave that is in Gaza. Now, these war graves have been disturbed at best or have been desecrated as part of what has been taking place when it comes to the war. The Guardian is the one who's been running on this story here, and they have focused in on a family member of one of those whose grave is one of those potentially in question with this war grave in Gaza. In the quiet of her living room, tears welling in her eyes, Wilma shares the inscription that was carved into the now ruined tombstone of her father, Albert Kemp, an Anzac buried at the Gaza War Cemetery. This is a picture of her father, by the way. Now, the IDF have responded to all of this, saying that the military destroyed the graves to deal with underground terrorist infrastructure identified within the cemetery and its surrounding area, a claim that's been met with scepticism by some of the families of the Anzac dead. That is what was written by the Guardian. That also goes on to say that Wilma and her family now have no idea where Albert and his remains are. Now, interestingly, the Sydney Morning Herald, picking up within 24 hours of this story, have said that Australia is going to fix this war grave. Australia is going to make sure that where Albert has been for a long time, he and others their remains will remain intact. A Department of Veterans Affairs spokesman said there's been a significant damage to the cemetery, in which includes the graves of Australians. The Office of Australian War Graves is very concerned by the damage to the cemetery and Australian war graves. They'll remain committed to ensuring the restoration of all affected graves as soon as feasible. They said that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission planned to secure and repair the cemetery as soon as it was safe to do so. However, it expected that full reconstruction would take some time, as the immediate post-conflict priority would be directed to humanitarian efforts. So, one of those ones where stories beneath stories beneath stories to the side of stories, but all of them worth knowing this evening. All right, can you know what you think at any time? Send me an email, paul@skynews.com.au. If you can make it to Burnie in Tassie in a couple of Sundays' time, our town at skynews.com.au.